is iconoclasm. So I'm sure we'll have a controversial talk and discussion today. Mr. Hitchens is a columnist for The Nation and Vanity Fair and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. And today he's going to discuss the motivation for and implications of U.S. policy initiatives in the Middle East over the past year, including the U.S. confrontation with Iraq, which looks like it may be renewing soon, and the U.S. bombings of Afghanistan and Sudan, and developments in both the Arab-Israeli peace process and the Cyprus conflict. Mr. Hitchens is the author of Hostage to Victory about Cyprus and Where the Borders Bleed about the Kurds, and he is co-editor with Edward Said of Blaming the Victims about the Palestinians. So after his prepared remarks, he's prepared to take questions and comments, so I hope we can have a lively discussion. Mr. Hitchens.
Thank you. I think it's now incumbent upon me to be very statesmanlike, moderate, and responsible and middle of the road, because as Disraeli once said, a similar conjuncture of crisis, the hour is great, but I regret to say the honourable gentlemen are small. I think it could be said of the Institute that it knows how to time a meeting of this sort. I think we are met at an unusual conjuncture, and it actually affords almost the perfect opportunity to review what the Middle East has meant in the foreign policy of this administration and what this administration's foreign policy has meant in the Middle East. One should begin by saying, I think, that especially those of us who are proud to say that they've been the friends of the Palestinians through good and bad times, mainly bad over the last several years, that few of us would have given very good odds that the first United States president to go to Gaza and address the PNC would have been Mr. William Jefferson Clinton. I think that it's hard to forget that his first act in seeking the nomination for the Democratic Party in 1972 was to solicit the support of AIPAC and to denounce George Bush on the loan guarantee question, and in every way to suggest that he was plus royaliste que le roi. It was a case of Clinton, Gore, Shamir, 92. It was one of the several instances, in fact, the other being Cuba, where he ran against Bush and Quayle from the right in a process we've now come to know as triangulation. But triangulation brought Mr. Clinton to Gaza in a strange way, though he could do no other. I thought there were chance there, an opportunity was missed. Everybody knows and has known for a long time that the only eventuation of this process can be mutual recognition between two states in the land of historic mandate Palestine. Mr. Clinton went yesterday only to supervise the implementation of a demand from the Likud party that the Palestine National Council amend its charter, an amendment, I must say, I think that should have taken place voluntarily many years ago, and in many respects was done at the Algiers summit a decade or so ago. But the opportunity missed is for him to say, well, now I must go to the Knesset. I must ask the Likud party to stop displaying a map of both sides of the River Jordan on its documents, and indeed to drop all claims of this kind, to say that apparently the gift from God of this territory, which isn't after all a security consideration, the gift from God of this territory did not come with batteries included. It seems that some assembly is required. The promise doesn't come with the means to implement it, in other words. It should be dropped from politics. That, I think, would have been an irresistible thing for an American statesman to do at that moment, and would have paved the way for resolution in the Knesset dropping opposition to a Palestinian state. Chance is missed. Why is the chance missed? Because, in my judgment, this administration does not think, and now, I won't say through no fault of its own, now cannot really think very far beyond the next news cycle. And thus we're met today at a really extraordinary moment where the President has to decide whether the Butler report must make him conclude that this time we not just really mean it, or really, really mean it, but we really, really, really mean it. There will be no more warnings. Well, the no more warnings was the last warning if you recall. And so it looks as if the president must order some kind of show of force. And he's got to be sharp about it, because some say this is overstated as a consideration, but Ramadan begins on Friday. It's thought that the general impression in the rest of the Muslim world, and not just the Muslim world, might be somewhat conditioned by opening Ramadan with lighting up the skies over Baghdad yet again. But if he doesn't do it, if he decides to do it before Ramadan, then he has to do it while Congress is met solemnly to decide whether he's fit to hold the office of president in the first place. And then people will say, will they not, could this be Mr. Clinton using Iraq as a weapon of mass distraction? And then what fools we should all look. Now, there's a reason why people would be bound to ask that question, in my judgment. One is because the president is and has always been and looks like an incredibly shifty opportunist. There's no way around that. The other is because it would be a president of iron will and self-denial who might not consider such an option if faced with articles of impeachment. But there's a third and even graver reason, which is that it isn't very widely discussed outside the famous Beltway, but within the famous Beltway it's pretty much, how shall we put it, discreetly, by nods and winks and other means of communication, agreed that that was a very germane question to ask about the rocketing of Khartoum and of Afghanistan in August. I've been writing about this a lot. I think I've now written about 8 columns about it. Let me quickly summarize what I mean by the wag the dog effect, and how horrifying it can be to find that an easy joke that anyone could make on the day dies on the lips as it becomes apparent that it wasn't a joke at all. In hitting the Al-Shifa chemical plant in outside Khartoum on the day before Ms. Lewinsky was due to return to the grand jury, the administration first made several claims. It said this plant does not make any medicine or chemicals for agriculture. It does, on the other hand, make at least the precursor chemicals for a poison gas, the EMPTA, and it has direct business ties through a military-industrial complex. No one knew Sudan had a military-industrial complex till then, with Mr. Osama bin Laden. Therefore, it will be hit with a flock or flight of cruise missiles. Now, there were 2 kinds of objection to this. One is, are those claims true? And 2, if they are true, do they license hitting Sudan without warning, without admonition, without the making of a démarche to a country with which, after all, the United States enjoys, even if in the most exiguous way, diplomatic relations? Well, to the first point, Secretary Cohen has already admitted, well, yes, the plant does make whatever else it makes, and it may be a factory of hell and death, but it does make medicines, and it does make chemicals for agriculture, and those could be seen in, indeed, the wreckage. So though not many people were actually killed in the rocketing, a large number of Sudanese are going to die down the road, because everybody knows what happens in a third world country with small resources that is suddenly deprived of its means of killing agricultural pests and of curing various deficiency diseases. And also everybody knows who dies first in these occasions, which is to say the most vulnerable, the young and the old and the infirm. So it can't be said to have been a casualty-free hit. So it would have been nice if the Secretary had established beforehand, rather than after, that yes, it did make a lot of medicines. And if they didn't know that, how reliable is what they say about EMPTA and VX? Well, I've talked to the expert on the subject, the professor of biochemistry at Oxford University, who says finding EMPTA in the soil outside a factory proves nothing, even if the soil sample does have EMPTA, but somehow they can't find the soil sample to produce it, it would prove nothing on its own. It's a valueless claim. He said it must mean they have something to hide, or they've made a terrible mistake. The direct suspicion is, and I talked this morning to Milt Burden, who was the Central Intelligence Agency station chief in Khartoum for many years and later helped direct the Afghan Mujahideen operation, and knows in this dimension Sudan and Afghanistan more and better than anyone else in the field. And he said that it seemed to him very likely that this sample had been taken by Egyptian agents, and that Egypt had what he described as a proprietary interest in the Sudan, because their river runs through it, as is notorious, and that they might have a motive for finding, etc. But even if they found that, it's not conclusive. Then we have the president saying that he waited up all night. He told this in a lip-biting address to an audience on Martha's Vineyard immediately afterwards, to make sure that there was no night watchman at this factory who could be killed, who perhaps had a family and children and who meant everything to him but nothing to the president, and he was anxious not to inflict this kind of pain, borrowing all that speech, incidentally, from the identical speech made by Michael Douglas in that mediocre film, The American President. It's not very reassuring to find the President of the United States borrowing from a B-movie and talking sentimentally. Michael Douglas says, I think at the time, trying to get Annette Bening to remove her underwear. It couldn't be less relevant to the present case, but he says, somewhere in Libya right now there's a janitor, and he's a good man, and he's got a family, and he's going about his job, and he doesn't know that in a couple of hours he's about to be vaporized because the building of which he's the janitor we think is the Libyan intelligence HQ. No, that's Clinton's Martha's Vineyard speech. Worrying. But I thought, before I worked out about the Michael Douglas thing, I thought how interesting that the president should want to reassure himself that a chemical weapons factory must be a chemical weapons factory because it didn't have a night shift or anyone to guard it. That didn't seem to me to compute, and these are the risks you run in having an improvised, to make it up as you go along, foreign and military policy, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, it is funny, okay, but you can see the unfunny side, I hope. Not having a sense of humor is often a very good thing, I feel. Now, suppose, though, let us grant that it could be established, which it has not been, because the United States is now in the position of refusing the Sudanese demand to the UN that there be an on-site, independent forensic inquiry. The United States is denying a Sudanese request to the UN for that. Keep that in mind. But I don't think it can be or will be proven. Let us suppose it could be proven that VX was being manufactured in this unguarded pharmaceutical plant. Why was there no démarche made to the Sudanese? Why did nobody say, either privately to the president or directly at the United Nations, we have the gravest suspicions about this factory. We have just lost some brave overseas officers in 2 embassies in Africa. We take it very seriously. We demand to see inside that factory, and you have 2 days. And a refusal will be construed as unfriendly, hostile act. They can't move the factory in 2 days, nor I think could they very much have altered its production line. That demand on its own would have been reassuring. There was, in other words, no great hurry, or there would not have been if there was not the suspicion that there was a hurry, but that it was not a hurry that was to do with diplomacy in Khartoum or indeed Afghanistan. That is the awful suspicion, self-generated, under which the administration will have to labor in the next few days as it decides what to do about the situation in Mesopotamia. I should just add about Afghanistan that the cruise missiles, which were held to have destroyed the infrastructure, another word that doesn't usually get used about Afghanistan, of Mr. Bin Laden's network. Oh, I should just add before we leave Sudan, when the French wanted Carlos the Jackal, when they wanted the Sudanese to give him up, the French gave him up on request. When the United States wanted Mr. Bin Laden removed from Sudanese soil, they made a démarche. Mr. Bin Laden was removed from Sudanese soil. There was no reason to think that business couldn't be done with the Sudanese regime, in other words. So I think a tremendous violation of diplomatic norms and precedents, as well as everything else. In Afghanistan, another flock of cruise missiles lands, not all of it in Afghanistan, because some of them hit Pakistan and don't explode. And it seemed to me that was the perfect month, probably, to let Pakistani nuclear scientists find an unexploded American missile lying on their soil. It couldn't be better after the exchange of nuclear detonations in the summer on the Kashmiri border, both of which the administration claimed to have had no warning of and to be taken by surprise entirely, as if the Indians would think, the United States seems to be helping China to acquire military nuclear technology. It's certainly been helping the Pakistanis. I wonder if we should ever do anything about that. The thought that that might occur to the Indians doesn't seem to have occurred to anyone in Washington. Again, sarcasm can be a foe of a good argument, but it can be very difficult to keep an edge of it out of one's voice simply when giving a literal account of what the calculations were. Simultaneously in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, as a result of it finding itself without warning being peppered with cruise missiles. And what could a warning have hurt? If they'd given them a few hours warning, they couldn't have told Mr. bin Laden to move. But they were holding 2 suspects in the bombings in Africa, in Karachi. And there's every likelihood they were going to turn them over. And when they found that they'd been hit without warning, they let those guys go. So let's say counterproductive would be the weakest word. Unintended consequence might be another. A number of Pakistani officers were killed, that's the officers who are helping to train the Kashmiris, in the camps which were built for them by the CIA for an earlier war against the Russian occupiers. But Mr. bin Laden doesn't seem to have been hit at all, and there was a call, well, let's have some aerial photography, let's see how well we did with this infrastructure, knocking over a lean-to here, mud hut there. The reply was, well, there's very bad cloud cover today, the satellites can't really see. That got them through the next news cycle. A very good letter in the Washington Post 3 weeks later, which I was glad to see the Post put in a box on its letters page saying, surely those clouds must have moved by now. Perhaps we could have some aerial photography to see how we made out with the missile strike. This is really no way to conduct a serious foreign policy. It's no way this is the way that a banana republic would conduct foreign policy if it were a banana republic. And it's this habit, therefore, of improvisation and of opportunism, I think sometimes rising to the level of cynicism, that has to be one of our great concerns as we move to what may have to be a confrontation with the Hussein regime in Baghdad. I don't call him Saddam because I don't know the guy. And I rather distrust people who do. Now, I think that one can find evidence of what one could call at best short-termist thinking throughout this whole process. After all, the Oslo Agreement, which was not the administration's idea, probably wouldn't have come to fruition if it had been supervised by the administration, was then claimed, well, they say, well, if we didn't do the work, but can we have the photo op? Well, nobody is going to say no to having their photo op on the White House lawn, so that's done. And there's certain agreements are made. Then they're left to rot and drift, and nothing is done about them until just before the midterm elections, it's decided some repair work must be done, and it would be nice if the high contracting parties met and had that handshake all over again and agreed to what had already been agreed under apparently American supervision. And Mr. Netanyahu, not one to miss such an opportunity, brings up the most microscopic demands of self-interest, including the disgraceful demand that the United States release the convicted Israeli spy, Jonathan Pollard. And the president is evidently prepared to bargain on this basis rather than have a walkout on the eve of the elections until his own Central Intelligence chief says that he will resign if that's done. The proper response to Mr. Netanyahu would have been to say, in that case, if, as you say, you've packed your bags, I wish you would get out, bag and baggage right now. We do not bargain like this. This is not the souk. But if we are going to bargain, by the way, what about Mordecai Vanunu, about whom many members of Congress have been trying to catch the president's attention for some time? No, no such thing. Apparently, again, the shortest term thinking. And as a result, every bump in the Israeli-Palestinian road, and there will be a number of them, I would say, before the proprieties of mutual recognition are concluded, every bump has become a superpower question. Every little curlicue and wrinkle and knot in the process demands the full engagement of a superpower and its intelligence services. This seems to me to be very rash. It seems to make the best the enemy of the good, and to also offer a standing temptation to local opportunists to pull on that chain and try and invoke that whenever they can. And so I don't think you could have had a gathering, really, of 3 more politically unstable and cynical and domestically motivated men than between Netanyahu, Arafat and Clinton last week. It looked to me like a scene from the bar in Star Wars, the worst bar in the galaxy, as they all met. And I remember thinking to myself, it's just as well none of these guys do have any principles, because just think what their principles would be if they did have any. But now anything any of those locals care to do can become a superpower question. Now, that's also true in another case that I want to draw people's attention to, which is that very looming and menacing situation just a little east of the little west of the Holy Land, the island of Cyprus, which has been an American responsibility now for a very long time, and where it's been thought that at least the ugly partition line that was jaggedly hacked across the island in the summer of '74 was better than no partition at all. And when asked why it was better, said, well, because things have been stable since then. It's calmed the situation down. Well, if only that were true, it would still, I think, be a very sordid bargain, but such has not been the case. While the surface has been calm, Greece and Turkey have been rearming at an extraordinary rate, very much, I'm afraid to say, by means of buying American weapons, and from a country and a policy that seems quite happy to sell them to both sides, perhaps not asking what they want them for, and thus to risk a war in NATO at just the moment when NATO is being sold as an enlarged entity that will keep the peace between at least its members, if not between its members and our otherwise gallant ally, Boris Yeltsin, who we trust on everything else, apparently, and will finance to the nth degree on any request he has, but who we must believe is about to try and invade Central and Eastern Europe again, or we wouldn't be forcing everyone to join a military alliance that isn't really needed after the demise of the Warsaw Pact. But I digress. An enormous concentration of violence is now being erected on both sides of the border in Cyprus. Anyone who's been there recently can see it. I think it has now more tanks to the square mile than anywhere else in the world. Air and naval bases are being built at a great rate on both sides. Huge military budgets are being spent by both sides in Cyprus and by Greece and Turkey. And further to that, all the way across the Aegean, there are flashpoints now which could connect to Cyprus, or which Cyprus could connect to the mainland at any flashpoint, a long and very unstable zone where Turkey's given warning suddenly that it doesn't really respect or recognize the treaty under which the Dodecanese archipelago was transferred from Italian to Greek sovereignty, and made this plain, again, not by making a démarche to Washington or to Athens or to any of the other supervising treaty parties, but by landing troops on one of the more barren islands in the archipelago and announcing its discontent that way, something that could, and in Nicholas Burns's judgment nearly did, lead to a war, thought probably about 45 minutes away from it at one point. And we're probably no more than about 45 minutes away from it at any moment of the day. Now, that episode, you may remember, meant that Mr. Richard Holbrooke's trip, his public diplomacy operation, was cancelled. He was going to go to Ankara, Athens, and Nicosia and meet everybody and get started. He was calling this the year of Cyprus, the year we get it done, get it settled, it's been on the agenda too long, all these absolutely correct statements. That in itself was enough to call off the trip, which has not been resumed, and was at the time being run as a policy, not exactly of the administration, of which Mr. Holbrooke was the accredited envoy, but by paying Mr. Holbrooke's law firm a certain number of billable hours to do Cyprus every week. The franchising, the subcontracting of foreign policy is another new feature of this administration, and I would say not the most reassuring one. And I'm someone who has great respect for Richard Holbrooke and his intelligence and his courage in volunteering to take on Cyprus, which has been a graveyard of reputation. But you notice nothing since then. It doesn't seem that it's in anyone's great interest to take this subject up, and yet I would say with the same certainty that one could have pronounced on Kosovo 3 years ago, this is coming towards us. It's coming like a train. It's coming like Christmas. It's coming like your next heart attack. The decision is to, well, then we can watch it come. We'll wait, we'll deal with it when it does happen. This is not just the height of irresponsibility, it's the definition of irresponsibility. It means you're only a superpower for purposes of, immediate and perhaps malicious and short-term revenge on countries like Sudan and Afghanistan. This is to get all the proportions of superpowerdom wrong, it seems to me, to have an elephantine policy conducted for the pettiest of reasons and for the shortest term consideration. I think I must have made it clear what I think, and perhaps also how I think about this, and about the very intense and awkward moment that we're confronted with now, from Capitol Hill to Baghdad, and the reasons why this moment absolutely maximizes all the possibilities of the worst outcome for the worst reasons. So if I haven't made it clear that that's what I think and also how, I don't think I think I'd be piling Pelion upon Ossa if I continued. But I'm very aware of the fact that there's probably nobody in this room who doesn't know more about it than I, and my hope is that people come to meetings like this to speak as well as to listen, so I'm all yours. And thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for a very refreshing exposition. I'm tempted to ask you what you think the administration is doing wrong, or should I say what the administration is doing right. Just to start off the questions, and I assume that...
You mean you want to know what I really think?
And I assume that the silence in the audience will mean that they agree to everything that you've said. So, but I wish you would say a little bit more about Iraq, because that is the looming situation, and it strikes me that the president may be a victim also of coincidental timing. I mean, the wag the dog thesis is one that's makes compelling journalism and not very good movies, but it is true, number one, that Butler's report has now indicated that the Iraqi regime has not been complying, and so the reason for holding off the attack earlier is now no longer there. And even if you go into the August bombing of Afghanistan and Sudan, they did come a week after bombings of American embassies and tremendous loss of life. And my sense of the administration is they wanted something to be swift in what they declared to be a war on terrorism. So I think an equally good case can be made for the fact that the timing was unfortunate but not intended, and not intended to be involved with the domestic problems of the president or to be diverting attention. I mean, the very fact that it's a classic, at least, myth of foreign policy that when a president or a leader gets in policy, they immediately have to start a war to divert attention, I think is something that can't really be demonstrated historically. So I'm really taking issue with your general thesis, and I'd like to hear you respond to that.
Well, I'll do it in reverse order, if I may. It must have occurred to everybody by now that this is not a president who commits military force promiscuously. I mean, if it's a matter of Mr. Slobodan Milosevic or Mr. Saddam Hussein, on the whole, the president is willing to allow us quite a lot of time and issue quite a lot of warnings. The reason why I think I'm right and you're wrong about Sudan is precisely because the process of making a public warning to Sudan within a day or two of the bombings in Africa of the embassies would have certainly been a rapid response to terrorism. They said, we think we found one of the origins of this plot against our diplomacy, and we certainly don't take it lightly, and this is what we will do if less satisfaction is afforded us. And the Sudanese have, let's say, 2 days to satisfy us on this point. No such démarche was made. And there's no one knowledgeable who I've talked to who doesn't believe that could have been done. And we also know from Seymour Hersh's extraordinarily well-researched article in the New Yorker that 3 out of 4 of the Joint Chiefs were not told of the operation, and no one in the FBI, which was all over Africa at the time, combing for suspects and finding them, was informed. Mr. Louis Freeh wasn't informed, and nor was anyone with knowledge of the region at the Central Intelligence Agency. This, I think, licenses the suspicion that when people thought they were joking about Wag the Dog, as Bertolt Brecht once said, the one who laughs is the one who hasn't yet heard the terrible news, might not have been joking after all. At any rate, an administration that behaves in such a way as to incur that suspicion is going one day to come into a position where it's boxed in as this one now is, where there seems to be no way of appearing to do the right thing for the right reasons. I don't think anything Mr. Clinton can do in the next 2 days could possibly be construed as having been done without an opportunist subtext. And I think that is the outcome of having been a fairly successful escape artist for a very long time. One day, all the chariots will come up on the same line, and you're stuck. And I think that's what's happened to him.
If I could just say, I understand your criticism of the Sudan operation, but let's assume that they didn't do the Sudan operation, the Afghanistan operation. wouldn't seem to me to be to come under your criticism of the wag the dog effect, in the sense that that was more legitimate.
Not in the same way, no, I agree. Well, and I hope I made that clear. I mean, when the agency said, or not the agency, when the administration said that it was a one-shot window, the gang is meeting here, we know where, we know when, we won't have another chance to hit them. That's not like saying we know what's in this factory and then having to take it back later on, which, if you remember, Secretary Cohen did have to do. No, one's entitled to the presumption of innocence in that case. But then you'd have thought with that number of cruise missiles they'd have hit one of them, and they didn't. So we don't know that they really knew there was this terror summit going on. And it would have been a funny thing for all the guys to do 2 days after hitting 2 American embassies, say, I know let's do. Let's all go and stand in the same place somewhere. I mean, it's not what I would do, but then I hope that neither you nor I have a terrorist psychology. But let's say that most humans are gifted with the instinct of self-preservation. I mean, look, I don't believe a word of what the administration said, and I don't think the administration expects one to believe it, and I don't think they believed it themselves. I think the fact is that they did what I suggest they did. Suggested they did. At any rate, now, the fact is that it's now been redubbed Wag the Dove, I think, by 1 or 2 people, that anything done would be misconstrued. So it could be that, let's say, now would be the ideal time to make some sort of démarche to Saddam Hussein of a military kind, but you couldn't because people would think that you were doing it for. So you can't do what you ought to do because people would think you were doing it for the wrong reason. That's why I ended by saying the right thing for the right reason. It seems to be something the administration has robbed itself of the ability to accomplish.
We have several questions. Peter, back up.
Thank you. My question to you is, do you feel that there is a structural problem in Washington which has many dimensions, but one of them is the apparent instinct not to use expertise that is available, particularly by the Clinton administration, but also by the Reagan administration. The politicization of the foreign policy machinery. You obviously are very well connected to the foreign policy machinery. That's why I asked the questions. We have in this country people who really know the Middle East quite well, and they have been not only avoided, they've not been brought into the debate at all, and particularly by those 2 administrations. Is that your reading as well, and do you think that it makes a difference? The politicization of the foreign policy machinery. I often try to draw comparisons to Canada and Great Britain, which on some levels are similar but seem to operate very differently. They do not see the crises in Iraq the way we do. They do not see the crisis in Sudan the way we do. And if I just may sneak in one final comment, when we talk about Islamism in Sudan, the one country that has a legitimate concern from a national security point of view would be France. Both because of its domestic situation as well as its proximity to Algeria. Yet France has had a flourishing embassy in Sudan at all the time that the United States has not. And my analysis is that it is not the result of foreign policy considerations, that it is a result of personnel considerations.
Well, I don't think that the foreign policy world in Washington is by any means shorn or void of expertise. I mean, if the administration can be well advised and by brilliant people anytime it chooses, I think that it's a matter of what I was saying about, say, the Sudan incident, was that the way the decision was taken seems to have excluded as many people as possible. Yes. Because the more the question was revolved or pondered, the more the disadvantages of this course of action and the speed of it would have become apparent. So, and they can all read. They know people offer them free advice all the time through the newspapers and magazines. There are some disadvantages to having a completely professionalized foreign policy equipe, I think. I certainly wouldn't propose the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office as a model for anybody. I mean, I think, for example, it was by listening too much to that body that the United States was led into error over Bosnia, for example. Because the Foreign and Commonwealth Office always says the same thing faced with situations like that. They always say, why don't we partition it? Let's see if that works. It seems to me the great contribution of my fellow countrymen. I was born in England, as some of you can probably tell. to 20th century geopolitics is the theory and practice of partition. After Ireland, India, Palestine, and Cyprus, it stops looking like coincidence, I think. It was proposed, they tried it for Eritrea after the war. Lord Carrington, Lord Owen's predecessor, at the Foreign Office as well as in Bosnia, was working on a partition plan for South Africa while Mandela was still in jail. They thought about it for Zimbabwe. They proposed it only too successfully to Mr. Dulles and Mr. Eisenhower for Vietnam. That was Eden and Macmillan, I believe. Certainly Eden, who proposed that. And on and on it goes. In Bosnia, the proposal for cantonization and therefore ethnic cleansingization was offered, with all the weight of historical expertise behind it. So I think that's easy to overstate.
Question here?
Yes, I'd like to ask you about Cyprus, and so I'm working on that now and read your book. At the
Can't ask for more than that.
at the conclusion of your remarks, you were critical of the administration, but Ambassador Holbrooke is there now. They are trying. What specifically would you have the United States do about Cyprus? Because I agree with you. I think this is really looking very bad.
Well, I think that since Cyprus is one of the reasons, one of the most salient reasons why Turkey has been now more or less definitively told by the European Union that it won't get in this or the next cycle of admissions, and told that, by the way, specifically by the then German foreign minister, Germany having been the patron of the Turkish effort and the Turkish association ever since the 50s. The danger of the American present policy of the United States is that Turkey will turn to America and say, well, we don't need Europe, we've always got our American friend, and thus won't be forced to confront what Europe is trying to confront it with. What it seems to me has happened is the United States has said, yes, okay, we won't leave you friendless. Indeed, we will help you have a military axis with Israel. Again, I don't think perhaps the very best thought out policy in the Near East at the moment. Some very dire long-term implications for that, I believe, especially for those who want to involve Syria in the peace process. Further, that seems to have given Turkey the idea, too, that it can use its military bludgeon against neighbors, and that the United States won't urge it to cease and desist. Currently, the Cyprus government, wisely or otherwise, is exerting its right to self-defense by buying an air defense system. Turkey has command of the air at the present moment in Cyprus. It would be an irresponsible Cypriot government that didn't give thought to having an air defense system. Anyway, I think it meets most people's criterion of internal affairs. The Turks have said if the Cypriots install it, they're buying it from Russia. They'll take it out, they'll bomb it. No, I have not seen anyone from the administration saying, don't say things like that. Don't talk like that. We don't like it when you say things like that. Not a word, not a squeak.
Mr. Talbot recently did in a speech.
Well, he made I would actually say,
reference.
Since you bring up that name, I would say that counts as the squeak. You can't say not a squeak if Mr. Talbot has spoken. I agree.
Question here.
In terms of Iraq and the role of UNSCOM, the reports that they were directly receiving orders from the State Department, are those reports true, and what is the position of Mr. Brooks in all this?
Of Mr.?
Is his name Brooks? The
Butler.
Butler.
I ran into Mr. Butler the other day and said that he was at the time obviously not very happy with Mr. Scott Ritter and his allegations, until I pointed out to him that till Ritter came along, Butler had been thought of as the hawkish hardliner, and now he could be more centrist. And a sudden look of distant pleasure came over his face as he thought that might be true. Look, there are some allegations that if true, would be extremely grave about the extent to which Iraq has been planning for non-compliance. Organizing in advance non-compliance, conspiring for non-compliance, which have been, and that the extent of its non-compliance may go all the way to just short of the fissionable material for preparation of nuclear devices. That's the Ritter view. You don't have to believe that to be to triangulate in favor of Mr. Butler, saying, well, they don't comply, and we think we know why. We think they're still trying to have weapons that would be a threat to all their neighbors. Now, there's an unanswered question also from the chairman from the beginning about this. In my opinion, ever since 1974, with the attempt to play off the Kurds against the Baathists and also to do both ends against the middle policy with Iran and Iraq. The United States policy has always had the following element. We want to be able to stand tall in the Middle East and show who's boss, but we may need Mr. Saddam Hussein as a proxy of some sort someday. The Kurds, as everyone knows, were abandoned when the Shah and Saddam Hussein made their agreement over the Shatt al-Arab. So there was another tilt, as it's rather, I think, pathetically called, back to saying, okay, lay off, we abandon the Kurds. Then, I think it is now established that when Iraq attacked Iran after the Islamic Revolution, that it had the understanding that the United States at least wasn't opposed to the idea. That led to a war in which you don't want to think about how many of the young men of Iran and Iraq were killed, effectively for nothing, while the United States armed both sides, and as Henry Kissinger so fragrantly put it, we wish we could work out a way that they could both lose, while all these people were being killed. To the extent, the tilt to Iraq, to the extent that when the USS Stark is hit by an exocet right in the Gulf, every attempt is made to find that the Iraqis were doing their best. There had been a very unfortunate accident. Usually, you know, when you lose that number of crewmen, someone's supposed to feel the hurt of it. No, every effort made. A few years actually, not very many years after the Stark incident, Iraqi civilians are being turned into fat at the bottom of shelters in the middle of Baghdad. There's another tilt. And then everyone knows the rest. The Bush, Pearl, Schwarzkopf fan dance, and the one ever since. They have to make up their minds. Do they want to rule Iraq through a crippled and diminished Hussein? Again, perhaps for a future tilt. Or do they want to remove him? And the fact is that I don't think the collective mind of the administration is made up on this point, and also that many of the players, the American players in this game, have at different times thought both things, sometimes simultaneously. So I think that's where the call for clarity needs to be made.
We have a couple other questions. Let me just say, I think your statement, if I heard it correctly, that the Iraqi attack on Iran in 1980 had a green light from the United States. I was in government at the time working on those issues, and I've never heard that in any government council, nor have I heard it in any historical discussion. I'd be interested in where you got your information on
I
that.
would have to produce, but I will, if challenged, I shall, if challenged, produce documents to you that suggest the contrary. And furthermore, the policy of the United States towards Iraq after that didn't seem exactly uncongenial.
Well, I'm talking about the start of the war.
Yes,
yeah.
but the subsequent policy followed seems to me to be consistent with that suspicion. But I can do better. But I'd have to ask for. I know it sounds like a Clintonoid before the grand jury, but I would I would have to call for some persons and papers, and I'd also have to break one or two confidences. But yeah, I think I could materialize that allegation.
Phil Wilcox.
I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm just a theorist of conspiracies. We'll have that clearly understood from the start.
Suppose the president were to ignore the potential that he would be accused of wagging the dove and decided to propose a new diplomatic approach to Saddam Hussein, which included both threats of force and incentives. Do you think Saddam Hussein would respond in a way which would get the UNSCOM process back on the track, and that would be, in responsible foreign policy terms, a better alternative than bombing?
Well, if that could be accomplished, it would be not only better than bombing, but it might lead to the end of the war on Iraqi civilians as conducted by proxy, by the sanctions policy, which, again, Saddam Hussein won't allow himself to make concessions that would, of the sort that would permit those, I think, very morally distressing and questionable sanctions to be lifted, because I think there's also something morally questionable about lifting them. But
there's no way out of this dilemma.
Well, not if you think that Saddam Hussein is actually, so to speak, a fascist megalomaniac. No. Then the problem is, at what cost should his removal be evaluated? Would that mean, if he's a fascist megalomaniac, then it would seem that the phrase "at all costs" would cover the policy of his removal. There are obviously costs that some people are not prepared to run. One of them is the supposed fragmentation of Iraq. Others are that one couldn't be sure that the next person would be as biddable as Saddam Hussein has been known to be in the past. I mean, I remember the time when Nizar Hamdoun, then the ambassador in Washington and a very well-regarded chap, and welcome at all parties and giving out Christmas presents to everybody and getting contracts from every possible department of commerce and agriculture for every order he put in. I remember the moment when he got the most elusive favor of all, which was the interview in the APAC Journal. I still have a copy of that interview. Moderate of the week. Interviewed by, and photographed as, you know, New Statesman like Iraqi. The interviewer was Toby Dershowitz, interestingly enough, Alan Dershowitz's daughter, if you don't mind. Amazing. You know, it's been that good before. Some people think it might get that good again. So do we really want to remove the guy? Well, I don't think this discussion has been conducted honestly or openly by the administration or its advisors. I would dearly like to know what they mean by any of this. But I myself hope very much that more and more support will be given to democratic and revolutionary forces in Iraq and in Kurdistan. I think that one should be looking for long-term friends in that quarter.
Question from David Mag.
First of all, let me compliment you on resisting the secretary that offered you a necktie this morning.
Well, the office tie was on loan today.
Or secretary or intern, as the case may be at your office. But getting at this wag the dog theory.
We have a good sort of ministry program.
Okay. I'm finding it very hard to understand why the president might have done what he did in convening the Y conference, spending endless hours with people that were not necessarily his favorite partygoers, and then his recent trips to Israel and to Gaza and the West Bank to try and get Y implemented. Why he would have done this for U.S. domestic reasons, because it seems to me that he has, if anything, paid a cost or at least taken considerable risks in terms of U.S. domestic politics and his relationships with the majority party in the Senate and House of Representatives by doing that. It seems to me that this is a case where belatedly, at long last, the president did the right thing for the right reasons, which was to try to get the Israeli-Palestinian talks unstuck so that our overall foreign policy in the Middle East would be more effective.
Well, then that would leave you only with this problem, I think, which is that between the signing ceremony, a little over 5 years ago now, and the Y agreement, there were very obvious signs of non-compliance with it, very correctable signs of non-compliance, which are by a rather unstable minority government led by Mr. Netanyahu, another person whose first name I won't use. People say everyone calls him Bibi. That's not true as long as I'm around. Now, I remember Madeleine Albright saying, how long ago was this? About 9 months ago. You know, we're giving Mr. Netanyahu till Monday. Then it was Wednesday. Then I think it was Thursday. And then it was gone. To do no more, by the way, than to live up to the signature and promise his predecessor government had already made and that he'd promised to honor. It was allowed to rot and decay for a long time, and he was allowed to walk away with the impression that that was something the administration wouldn't impose a very high cost for until the week before a hotly disputed midterm election. And so I'm sorry. I mean, given the rest of the background of this administration and given what some might describe as its MO, the suspicion does arise that suddenly we better do some repair work on a package that was already supposed to be signed, sealed, and delivered. And then when the meetings actually do take place, they always eventuate in a fizzle. I mean, the Israelis said they'd do a pullback by Friday. Now they say, we don't feel like it after all. We're not going to oblige you in that way. Well, at what point are they going to be told, well, if you don't, here's what will happen to you? It seems that's a weapon that could never even be half drawn from the scabbard. Or, for example, that they should, in return for the Palestine National Council's revision of the Charter, that the parties of Herut and Likud should drop their claim to both sides of the River Jordan and do it publicly, and do it now.
Objecting to the supposed failures, and I would agree with you on several of those points, of the administration in pressing its point with the Israelis. The fact is that, as I said, and I would agree with you, after a far too long delay, President Clinton did seem to stop letting Prime Minister Netanyahu set the agenda on this.
Yes, as you say, after what had been a rather long delay. In the other case, Sudan seeming to be suddenly in a tearing hurry. I just think these delays and these hurries are not just due to mix-ups in the president's Ritalin prescription.
No, I'm suggesting that it's due to an honest effort to try to repair a foreign policy that was in very bad shape in the area.
Well, I agree with the second part.
Can I pick you up on the forthcoming Iraqi crisis and try to relate it to the domestic situation? It seems to me that there is a consensus in favor of military action. I tend to discount the Columbus business, at least among the Congress and the administration. If it is true that there has been real noncompliance and a real attempt to thwart the latest inspection efforts, it seems to me that there's already a consensus, and indeed there was criticism of the president for giving Saddam one last chance, and therefore I don't see that he would be accused of cynicism except by carpers, marginal carpers, and I don't put you in that category because there really is a consensus, and if there are violations, it would seem to me that it would be an opportunity for the nation to come together rather than to have carping on both sides about political opportunism.
Well, I mean, let's have no carping, but if there was to be carping, I say again, it would derive such force as it had from previous policy mistakes, things both done and undone. It would be nice to think there was a consensus on it, but as I say, that involves, it seems to me, deciding what the objective for Iraq is going to be, because you can't just manage it. Does anybody think that if there was a strike now, say, to blind Saddam's communications, and sorry, I swore I wouldn't call him Saddam, to blind the Hussein regime's communications and to take out perhaps some of the presidential sites, and some of that would be the end of it, that he'd say, well, now I see, the error of my ways, we can start again. It wouldn't. It would be another in this long period of torturing the Iraqi people by means of pinpricking their government and starving them. I think this is a degrading way to be doing business. An announcement should be made of what they think the outcome in Iraq should be. Now, there has been an open statement that support's going to be given to the Iraqi democratic opposition and to the Kurds, and I think that's good, because the covert support to those people before led to them being betrayed, and also led to them being misrepresented as agents of a foreign power. I think it should be above board. If we can say that much above board, why not the rest of it? Why not the whole program?
Well, my sense was that the bombing may well not be pinpricks this time, but if they're talking about at least 10,000 casualties, that it could be moving in the direction of regime threatening, which is something of an objective, or at least a punishment.
As far as we know, it's an objective, but they won't say the objective is to, that would be the objective. This seems to me really, really potentially very irresponsible indeed. I mean, that's 10,000 is a lot. And we certainly don't have the right to use Iraq as a laboratory experiment or its people as laboratory animals. And as long as this is dragged on, it seems to me that's how it must feel to them and how it's beginning to look to outsiders. I think it would be much more just and more courageous to say, we consider the Hussein regime to be a common enemy of humanity, of its own people and of its neighbors. It can no longer be said that we'd be intervening in their internal affairs by saying this. I mean, their internal affairs have been very well interfered with. that boundary has been crossed, that fire break's been crossed, we're going to go in and remove the regime.
Hasn't Albright said that?
No. She said she wishes, that he'd go, but not that and replacing the regime would really mean entering Iraq and toppling it, and then encouraging the opposition forces to come out and hold an election form of provisional government. But that would mean staying on for some time. That's a commitment I don't think the president would dream of selling or trying to sell to the American people at this or any other time. He hopes, in my judgment, to pass it on to the next president, who may be upon us sooner than we think. But I think that was always what he wanted to do with Iraq. But it's no more grave and no more destructive an intervention than starving the Iraqis and dueling over their heads with the Ba'athist leadership.
You're saying that the ultimate requirement for this strategy to work is U.S. ground forces and several hundred thousand.
Well, or so to speak, an international brigade, to go into Iraq. And yes,
more than a brigade, though.
Yeah, yes,
talking about
using it as a metaphor for internationalism, as in, say, the attempted defense of the Spanish Republic. Say to Arab neighbors and others, look, it's got to come to the point we have to settle this. We have to move him out, but we have to move him out in such a way as we're simultaneously moving other people in. You could get him out by destroying the whole of Baghdad, of course. That would be unconscionable.
Well, perhaps we have a question here from...
Either kill him or take him to The Hague.
Mohammed Wafi.
Christopher, if you put yourself in the shoes of a Palestinian, and I know how committed you have been to the Palestinian cause, even way back, almost quarter of a century ago, when you were the rising star of British journalism.
My dear Mohammed.
How would you view the President Clinton's speech in the National Council, of the Palestinian National Council? And also, how would you assess the movement away by Clinton, who was described as being the most pro-Israeli president ever in the White House, moving away to the extent that he has moved now, in collision with not only with the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli cabinet, but also even with the pro-Israeli forces in this country. How do you assess, the two things? Putting yourself in the shoes of a Palestinian.
Yeah, I was very impressed when Clinton arrived and made his speech, so to speak, to the Israeli side, and he repeated all the old boilerplate about how they made the desert bloom and so on. I hadn't heard that particular one used for a while. And most Israelis are embarrassed to use it now.
Speaking about his
yeah,
speech.
I know, but I'm coming to it. I'm coming to it. I thought, well,
Okay.
I'm coming to it, Mohammed, believe me. I thought that was, I thought, oh dear, here we go again. So it was not a desert from which the Palestinians were expelled. They weren't living in a desert before. Some of them may live in a desert afterwards. So I thought, what will he say when he goes to Gaza? Well, he said dispersal and dispossession. I began, I think perhaps you were late, I began by saying the odds one would have given against hearing this from this president would have been very long, indeed, before. He's not going to say expulsion, and they're not going to demand it of him that he does. But dispersal and dispossession is quite a lot. Someone must have dispersed and dispossessed them. I wonder who that could have been. It's not a lie at any rate, and it's not as the opening speech was. But of course, the height of political cleverness is supposed to be, and it's endorsed by our entire journalistic and entertainment culture. The height of political cleverness is you go, you have two audiences, and you speak to both of them and tell them what you think they most want to hear. That's now thought to be brilliant, even though anyone can watch it happening. And points are awarded to presidents who can master this trick. I don't rate it as a very brilliant trick myself. Has it not been plain since also that the logic of mutual recognition is for two states mutually recognizing one another? Surely that's plain. Why is every advance towards it then the most grudging, the most meager, the most niggardly that can be possibly imagined? Why not say, as with Iraq, say, here's what the objective is, here's what we know is going to happen, here are the steps towards it, not each one having to be dragged out and protracted and negotiated each time with the maximum of ill will and bad faith. then, if you wanted the president to say a courageous thing, it would not be to go and tell the Palestinians what they want to hear so you get that photo op done, having had the precise same one. It would be to say, well, now that your National Council has been so brave as to make this recognition, I'm going to ask the Knesset to make another one. And then we'll have reciprocity and forward movement. This is not a guy who has, I don't think, neither the principles nor the courage nor the, it's an abuse of the word vision, even to consider such a policy. It got him through the next news cycle.
On that point,
What about the movement? I asked also about the movement away from January particularly until now. There has been a movement by the administration, you see, away from the pre-Netanyahu policies. There has been a consistent movement. Did you see this consistent? Do you see it as consistent?
No, I don't think of it.
You don't see it as consistent.
I think of it as improvised and short-termist, and reflecting no more than the realities on the ground. The fact is, there is now a Palestinian autonomy. I regard it as embryonically a state. I don't think it's possible to look at it in any other way. You can't make a child grow smaller, all right? The administration might want to or might not want to, but it simply can't. The question is, why is it described, why do they want, as far as possible, for its growth to be stunted and for its credentials to be questioned? So why don't they simply say, hey, we must live up at least to reality. There already are two peoples in this territory, and the rest follows as the night the day. They can't bring themselves to say it. Indeed, it's, as far as I know, the administration concurs with Mr. Netanyahu still in regarding any declaration of independence by President Arafat as a hostile act in and of itself, whenever timed, or however timed.
yeah, on your point about going to the Knesset and asking them to no longer consider Jordan Palestine, I think, that's a bit out of date, and it's also shooting a bit low, isn't it? Wouldn't it have been better to have gone and said, please stop your settlement activity?
Well, no, I was only going to demand what was rhetorically possible. That would have been nice, yes, but no, I'm not saying that would have been within Mr. Clinton's compass to do what I proposed. It would not be within his compass to say what you propose. I mean, I hope I'm still a realist. By the way, I mean, they should repudiate not just the idea that Jordan is Palestine, but also the idea that large bits of it are Eretz Israel. That's what they'd have to give up.
Oh, yes. This young lady here.
Hi. I was in Kuwait for a year and 3 months, and so I really got in touch with the population there, just the general normal people. And we've been stressing a lot from your discussion on the image of the United States government in the United States, but I wanted you to comment on two different issues as far as the United States image in the Arab world. The first is, after the bombing of Sudan, I was watching some TV shows in Arabic. Some of those TV shows were calling for more terrorist action against the United States in response to the United States bombing of Sudan. So I wanted you to comment on whether or not the policy was counterproductive. And then the second thing I wanted to comment on was the relation with Iraq. I know a lot of the general Kuwaiti population, not the government officials, but the general population, have a conspiracy theory that the reason we haven't taken out, the United States government hasn't taken out the regime, is because that the United States wants to stay there and they're getting paid to protect Kuwait. And so some of them are seeing it as a business. So what would be your solution to these kind of negative images?
I should say first that Andrew and Patrick Coburn, who are both good friends of mine and both very good writers and journalists and experts in this field, have jointly authored a book called Out of the Ashes about the comeback kid, this time Mr. Hussein, and the origins of this policy and its shortcomings, which will be out soon. I recommend anyone watching this or listening to me to get hold of it. And that will probably give you a more exhaustive answer than I have time for. I think it's certainly true that there were people who were angry enough to call for further assaults on the great Satan after the bombing of Sudan, but that's sort of too much in the nature of what can be expected. I don't believe it would have attracted many recruits to the side of Mr. Bin Laden, who professes a very extreme and arcane form of Islam and lives under the shelter of the Taliban. By the way, when the démarche was made to Sudan, and here's again fundamentally why I disagree with you on this, a few years ago by the US government, they said, you have a guy called bin Laden on your territory, we'd like him off your territory. And they complied. There was talk of sending him back to Saudi Arabia, where he could at least be, so to speak, under observation. And if you ask me, do I think Clinton would have rocketed Saudi Arabia on 2 days' notice if he could find a bin Laden business there? I think I would say the answer is definitely no. Even if he could find all of Mr. bin Laden's assets in one place in Riyadh, the Saudi princes are not going to read that they've been bombed on CNN. Or here, rather, they've been bombed on CNN. See what I mean? So they sent him to Afghanistan instead, a really crazy decision to have him hold up there. But I think his support and his reach is very, very limited.
But from what I know of the Saudis, they would have taken care of bin Laden on their own. He would have hardly found refuge in Riyadh. He would
Well, they
have
posted him on, they mailed him on to Afghanistan, which I think is a pity, because Afghanistan is not a country that needs to import fundamentalists, I gather.
We have a question. Henry Craig.
When you consider this range of crises from Cyprus, I would even throw in Iran, one is struck by the fact that the silence that comes from Europe, except for our faithful friends, the British, and also from the Middle East. Why don't we hear anything from Cairo or anything from the European community that really reflects the kinds of concerns that you've described?
Well, I think
does it make any difference?
And does it make any difference? Well, as to why not, I mean, I think it's because it's for two reasons. One is everybody wants to be on good terms with the United States. The other is because that's why you don't get much public criticism. The reason why you also don't get very much enthusiasm is because there is a widespread feeling that the last Gulf War was fought for reasons other than the ones advertised, and that perhaps some of those who were cajoled into joining the coalition were cajoled under, let's not say false pretenses, but an incomplete prospectus. And also because people don't want to increase the difficulties of this president, domestic or foreign, and also because they want to wait and see what's going to happen. So they're in the same position as we are. An administration somewhere above the law and somewhere beneath contempt, floating, and we have to wait and see. He used to say he felt our pain, now it's our job to feel his. Voila tout.
Oh, yeah, Peter.
I'd like to follow up on two previous questions, which I feel were not totally answered, and connected to my earlier question, and that is that I've been worried for a long time that the United States is so isolated in its Middle East policy. On the subject of Arab-Israel, as we all know, the vote in the United Nations was 124 to 4, the 4 being the US, Israel, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. And I think that speaks very loudly. On the subject of Iran, we are also totally isolated. On the subject of Saddam Hussein, I understood from the internet this morning that Kofi Annan said that this is really an American project, and that it is being built up here much larger than it is built up elsewhere. And what I want you to speak to and ask perhaps the lady's question in the back, what is the feeling from the region? How do you, of course, first of all, see the reasons for these threats that the United States seems to be so isolated in the Middle East? And secondly, if we do follow through with various policies, including Ambassador Sadar's suggestion that there may be a major strike with many casualties, what will be the response? What will be the results, and what will be the response?
Well, to your first point, it's not all that uncommon, though I think it's insufficiently remarked about this administration, that it should be the unilateralist and the isolationist power. I mean, on the matter of the International Court for Human Rights and War Crimes, the United States was in a tiny minority. In effect, it was the only, I mean, I think Sudan and Libya, oddly enough, were the other principal dissentients. And, of course, on the Landmines Treaty, the United States is the standout nation. And in both cases, the one that can make the difference. So the idea is that you're a superpower and believe in globalization unless it could possibly be that another country could want to treat the United States as an equal. That's your limit. So it's a very provincial-minded form of globalization. An isolationist culture and an internationalist imperative. Again, a bad basis for policy, I would say. But it also, I think, explains the reticence that we were trying to analyze. We can only speculate, but one of these reticences among, say, I can speak with some knowledge about the British and a little about the French, is precisely that they neither very greatly revere the way that America takes these decisions or comes to these conclusions, nor do they want to make it harder for them. And they do realize that the American decision will always be the decisive one. So they have to decide. They will determine their policy on the success or failure of the American one, in the case of Iraq, for example. So it's a poor answer, I'm only too aware, but I think that's the best one can do. I don't think the British would urge an immediate strike if it thought the United States was opposed to it, but if it thinks the United States is going to do it, then it will as far as possible say, well, this was our idea too, and we're all the way with you. Thus irritating the French, as usual.
Could I ask you to comment on another issue of concern currently, and that is Iran? How would you rate the administration, and what should the administration do, or what has it done right or wrong in that respect?
I don't think it's done, it hasn't been doing very much, but what it's done, what the statements that were made, I thought were actually one of the few bright spots in the picture. I thought that it's clear that we don't want it to look as if Mr. Khatami is an American idea, so that too much praise for him would be misconstrued. He doesn't want too much American praise, so he hasn't got too much. I thought that's a good decision. But encouraging noises about any acts of reciprocity on, in particular on the export of violence, either the means of violence or the incitement to it, or the assassination, say, of authors living in England who write fiction, things of this kind. I thought more could have been said on that heading, by the way, by the administration, but as a test case. But as it happens, the Khatami regime did come up to the mark on that. What I think is very clear is now happening is some kind of, what shall we call it, some sort of, not exactly an OAS, but a sort of death squad resistance is being mounted, probably with indulgence from some people in the military and security world in Iran against the elected president. And that's an incredibly grave state of affairs. But I perfectly see that it wouldn't be tactful for the United States to say, well, we stand 100% with Mr. Khatami.
Question here?
Yes, I'd like to solve two problems in about 5 minutes. I want to ask about Jerusalem. I had just read about some people saying the Jerusalem problem could be solved by perhaps an interreligious commission going in and running part of Jerusalem. And then I want to ask you about the Kurds, and I know the American Kurds believe that there could never be a Kurdistan, and they said there's really a lot of difficulty with integration within Turkey. And I guess I'd like to ask you, why would there be so much trouble with integration in Turkey? They keep saying it's the language, it's the culture, and I was wondering, we here have so many different languages and cultures. What do we do differently here? Is it just because we're a different democracy, or?
Well, maybe partly because people volunteered to come here rather than finding themselves where they have no say in being. I mean, I've always believed myself that is, with the exception of those who were brought to the United States against their will, the involuntary immigrants. I think one of the great things about the United States is people came here, so to speak, on purpose, and usually to escape conditions like the ones we're talking about in Kurdistan, to get away from the house of bondage, as was once said. Yes, there are cultural differences among the Kurds, and some of them may explain this bizarre process with Mr. Abdullah Öcalan, who I've met when he was in the Bekaa Valley and interviewed at some length. And I remember thinking, if I had hair, moustache, and facial features which, if left untrimmed and untended, would make me look more and more like Joseph Stalin, would I, A, emphasize these features, or B, de-emphasize them? He'd gone for plan A, on this, which wasn't very reassuring. But there was no doubt that he had a very well-organized force of extremely dedicated people there. I mean, they were the only actual organized force you could, walking through the Lebanese army isn't very difficult, I can tell you. And the other militias around there were pretty ragtag. PKK is a real regimented force and very highly motivated. The question, obviously, was there under Syrian protection. And the Turks have now succeeded in getting Syria to disown Mr. Öcalan. But the best explanation I heard for the connection between Mr. Öcalan and Mr. Hafez al-Assad is that they are both Alawites, which, as everyone knows, is a hidden key to the understanding of that region, the minority regime minority Ba'athist regime in Syria. And that, as well as the obvious, the element of not leverage, but of, vengeful threat that could be exerted over Turkey by Syria in this proxy form, there is a hidden sectarian element to it. And that struck me as quite congruent with what I'd seen elsewhere in the area, and to be very consistent with the sort of policies otherwise pursued by Assad, and to be a neglected ingredient in the equation. But those sectarian differences also reproduce themselves among the Kurds, as do linguistic differences. The Kurds don't find each other always mutually intelligible. And the work that's going on a Kurdish dictionary and standardization of the language at the moment, which is at the Institut Kurd in Paris, is not very far advanced. So the elements of nation building are still very much in their infancy. You asked me another question. Oh yes, more religious commissions in Jerusalem? No, there should be fewer religious commissions in Jerusalem. There should be a lot more secular activity in Jerusalem. Monotheism has been, I think, overrated as a solution to the problem of Jerusalem. One wants fewer and better monotheists.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. I think everybody joins me in thanking you for a very stimulating, not always agreed to presentation. I must say, I think Washington has found its gadfly, and under that hard exterior, I detect a considerable amount of idealism. So I think you're very good for our democracy. Thank you very much.
Very much.
Very generous of you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
I don't know whether
Well, that's very nice of you. I told him I would take them somewhere. Actually,
Have you heard him speak a lot?
I know he's a friend of mine for the last 25 years.
Oh, really? Wow.
I met him first in England, so when he was still very young.
Yes, you mentioned when he was the rising star of British.
He was still very young, and he became the editor of one of the most important papers there, the New Statesman.
Oh, yes, of course.
And he was only 23, 24, right? As he feels. That's happened. Brilliant, Christopher. Hi,
This guy's fantastic, isn't he? He's really good.
I think, yeah, it's more or less okay.
In the course of the random discussion, random defenses, random criticisms of administration policy, no one spoke with the issue of incompetence. It's rather underlying assumption of those who defend and critique here is that they I just came back. But
Yeah, I think very nice.
May I put a suggestion?
Yes. And
I think maybe
you
just
went
with
back.
physical cost.
Right.
Yeah, one master might just be, and I work at the public.
Exhausted because of incompetent